Establishing the beachhead. The Japanese had a mixture of combat and service troops in western New Britain. They used motorized barges to shuttle cargo and troops along the coast from Rabaul to Cape Gloucester. They utilized their fleet of trawlers and schooners enhanced by destroyers from the Japanese Navy for any more extended movements. Japanese troops that defended western New Britain were known as the Matsuda Force. General Iwao Matsuda was a military transportation specialist and a commander of an infantry regiment in Manchuria. When he arrived in February 1943 on New Britain, he took control of the battle-tested 141st Infantry from the Philippines conquest and additional anti-aircraft and artillery units. Matsuda established his headquarters near Kalingi, the coastal trail northwest of Mount Talloway, 5 miles from the airfields at Cape Gloucester. He ultimately changed his location to reflect his tactical challenges. The Allies increased their threat to New Britain as 1943 wore on. Japanese headquarters at Rabaul assigned General Matsuda's force to the 17th Division under Lieutenant General Sakai, recently arriving from Shanghai. Sakai's division was attacked en route and lost 2 of their 4 transports to submarine torpedoes and mines. An Allied air attack nearly wiped out the 3rd convoy. This deprived the Japanese defenders of 3,000 replacement and service troops. Lieutenant General Sakai deployed the remainder of his forces to western New Britain under Matsuda's tactical command. The mid-December Cape Mercus landings caused General Matsuda to shift his troops to combat the threat. This redeployment did not account for the lack of resistance at the Yellow Beaches. Matsuda was familiar with the terrain of western New Britain. He did not believe the Americans would storm the small strips of sand that extended a few yards inland, backing up to a swamp. Matsuda did not know the American maps labeled the beaches as a swamp forest. Even though the aerial photography taken after the initial preliminary airstrikes revealed no shadow within the bomb craters, there was evidence of a water level high enough to fill these depressions to the brim. Matsuda knew the airfields were the obvious prize, and did not believe that the Marines would plunge into the muck and risk becoming bogged down short of achieving their objective. Matsuda forfeited the immediate advantage of opposing the Marine assault force at the water's edge. Enemy troops were suffering the long-term indirect effects of eroding Japanese fortunes beginning at Guadalcanal and New Guinea. The Allies dominated the skies over New Britain, blunted any air attacks on the beach at Cape Mercus beachhead, and bombed at will throughout the island. While the airstrikes did minor damage except for Rabaul, they demoralized the Japanese troops, suffering from medicine and supply shortages because of the submarine and air attacks. An ineffective network of primitive trails hugged the coastline and increased General Matsuda's dependence on barges. The capture of Cape Mercus made his barges, convoys, and coastal shipping vulnerable to aircraft, and later to gunboats and torpedo craft. The 2 battalions that landed on the Yellow Beaches crossed the sands and plunged through a wall of undergrowth into a swamp forest. A Marine could slog through knee-deep mud, step into a hole, and then end up damp to his neck. A Japanese counterattack while the Marines lurched through the swamp forest could have inflicted severe casualties. General Matsuda lacked the roads and vehicles to shift his troops in time to take advantage of the terrain. The Japanese defenders were immobile on the ground and tried to retaliate by air. A flight of enemy aircraft sent from Rabaul was intercepted by Army P-38s. 2 Japanese bombers evaded the Army fighter planes and sank the destroyer Brownson with a direct hit, followed by an immense explosion. She took 108 crewmen with her. The rest were rescued by destroyers Daly and Lamson. When the first Japanese bombers came into view, a squadron of Army B-25s flew over LST's, landing ships tank, attacking targets at Borgan Bay south of the Yellow Beaches. Gunners on board the LSTs opened fire at the enemy aircraft, but mistook friend for foe and shot down 2 American bombers and damaged 2 others. The Allied planes, shaken by the experience, dropped their bombs too soon on the 11th Marines artillery positions at the left flank of Yellow Beach 1, killing 1 Marine and wounding 15 others. A Marine battalion commander from the artillery regiment later wrote, "It was like trying to dig a hole with my nose as the bombs exploded, trying to get down into the ground just a little bit more." By the afternoon of D-Day, the 1st Marine Division had established a beachhead. The 7th Marines assault battalions had pushed ahead and captured Target Hill on the left flank before pausing to await reinforcements. 2 more battalions arrived during the day. Landing Team 31 came ashore at 0815 on Yellow Beach 1. They weaved through the 3-7 Marines and veered to the northwest, leading the way toward the airfields at 0845. The 2-7 Marines landed and waded through the swamp forest between the 1st and 3rd Battalions, expanding the beachhead. The next infantry unit was the 1-1 Marines, reaching Yellow Beach 1 at 1300 to join the 3rd Battalion advancing on the airfields. The 11th Marines, despite the accidental bombing, set up their artillery with the help of amphibian tractors. Some of the amphibious tractors brought the 75mm howitzers from the LSTs directly to the battery firing positions. Other tractors were used to break a trail through the undergrowth to pull the more massive 105mm weapons. Army trucks loaded with supplies came ashore from the LSTs. Logistical plans called for these vehicles to move forward as mobile supply dumps, but the swamp forest proved impossible for the wheeled vehicles. Drivers abandoned their trucks to avoid being left behind when the ships moved out from the threat of Japanese bombers. The Marines built roads and corduroyed them with logs or shifted the cargo onto the amphibian tractors. Even with this enormous effort, the convoy still got underway with over 100 tons of supplies left on board. While the cargo and reinforcements crossed the beach, the Marines advanced inland and encountered the first real Japanese resistance. On December 26th at 10:15, the 3-1 Marines pushed ahead, forced into a column of companies by a swamp on the left flank that narrowed the frontage. The Japanese opened fire from camouflaged bunkers, killing the commander of Company K and his executive officer. These sturdy Japanese bunkers proved impervious to the bazooka rockets, which failed to detonate in the soft earth covering the structures. And the 37mm guns could not penetrate the logs protecting the Japanese defenders. An LVT-1 Alligator that had delivered supplies for Company K attempted to crush one bunker, but got wedged between 2 trees. Japanese snipers killed the tractor's 2 machine gunners before the driver could break it free. When the tractor lunged ahead, it caved in one bunker, silencing enemy fire and enabling Marines to isolate the 3 others and destroy them, killing 25 Japanese. A platoon of M4 Sherman tanks joined in to lead the advance beyond this first strongpoint. Japanese troops of the 1st Debarkation Unit provided the initial opposition, but General Matsuda had alerted his nearby infantry units to converge onto the beachhead. An enemy Japanese battalion moved into position late in the afternoon on D-Day. They were opposite the 2-7 Marines, who clung to a crescent-shaped position with both flanks protected by marshlands. After sunset, only muzzle flashes pierced the darkness as the firing intensity increased. The Japanese were preparing to counterattack. Amphibian tractors could not make supply runs until it was light enough to avoid the fallen tree trunks and roots navigating through the swamp forest. Before dawn, Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, the XO of the 7th Marines, organized the men of the service company and regimental headquarters into carrying parties. He loaded them with ammunition and waded with them through the dangerous swamp. Only one misstep and a Marine carrying bandoliers of rifle ammo or containers of mortar shells could slip, stumble, and drown. When the regimental commander reinforced the Marines with Battery D of the 1st Special Weapons Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Puller had the men leave the 37mm guns behind and carry the ammunition instead. A guide from headquarters met the column that Lieutenant Colonel Puller had pressed into service. He led the Marines forward through a blinding downpour driven by a monsoon gale. Obscured landmarks forced the heavily laden Marines to blindly wade onward. Each man clung to the belt of the man in front. Not until 0805, over 12 hours after the column started its march, did the Marines reach their goal, put down their loads, and take up their rifles to fight. The 2-7 Marines had been fighting for their lives since the first storm struck. A curtain of rain prevented mortar crews from seeing their aiming stakes. The battalion commander described these men firing as just guessing by God's will. Mud got into most of the small arms ammo and jammed machine guns and rifles. Marines abandoned their water-filled foxholes while the defenders hung on fighting. At dawn, Japanese soldiers moved toward the right flank of the 2-7 Marines, attempting to outflank them. They were possibly forced into that direction by the Marines' defensive fire. When Battery D arrived and moved into the threatened area, they forced the Japanese to break off their action and regroup.